The champagne glass slipped from my fingers as Ryan's voice boomed across the elegant ballroom of the Driskill Hotel. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet my wife, Jessica. She's just a little graphic designer, nothing too fancy like you tech geniuses." The crystal shattered against the marble floor, much like my composure in that moment. Around us, Austin's tech elite chuckled politely while I stood frozen in my simple black dress, watching my husband of 6 years reduce me to nothing more than an amusing footnote at TechFlow Solutions' annual gala. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What Ryan didn't know as he basked in the laughter of his colleagues was that 3 of the biggest tech companies in Austin had been quietly competing for my exclusive consulting services for the past 8 months. What he couldn't have imagined was that the woman he'd just dismissed as just a little graphic designer had been featured on the cover of Southwest Business Quarterly just 2 weeks earlier as one of the most influential marketing strategists in Texas. And what would have absolutely floored him was that the modest freelance income he thought I earned was actually a carefully constructed fiction to hide the 7-figure digital marketing empire I'd built while he spent his evenings playing video games and complaining about his coding bootcamp debt. The morning had started innocently enough in our Cedar Park home, a charming 2-story house with white shutters and a wraparound porch that Ryan believed we'd purchased together 3 years ago. I'd been in my home office, the small room tucked behind the kitchen that Ryan dismissively called my craft corner, reviewing a proposal for a tech startup that was offering me a $250,000 contract to completely rebrand their company before their IPO launch. The irony wasn't lost on me that this startup was TechFlow's biggest competitor, and their CEO had specifically sought me out because of my reputation for taking companies from obscurity to industry leadership in record time. My phone had buzzed, with a text from Ryan reminding me about the company party that evening. "Don't forget to dress nice tonight, babe. I want my colleagues to see I have good taste in women even if you're not in tech like the other wives." I'd stared at that message for a full minute, feeling the familiar sting of his casual dismissal wrapped in what he probably thought was a compliment. After 6 years of marriage, I'd grown accustomed to Ryan's tendency to treat my career as a charming hobby rather than a serious profession, but something about today's message felt particularly condescending. I'd set my phone aside and returned to the proposal spread across my desk, each page representing months of strategic planning and market analysis that would transform a struggling startup into a major player in the Austin tech scene. This was the kind of work that had built Apex Marketing Consultancy from a side project I'd started in our spare bedroom into one of the most sought-after boutique firms in the Southwest. But Ryan knew none of this. As far as he was concerned, I spent my days creating simple logos and business cards for local small businesses, earning just enough to contribute modestly to our household expenses. The deception hadn't been intentional at first. When I'd started freelancing 5 years ago, it really had been basic graphic design work, simple projects that I could complete while Ryan was at the office, bringing in a few $100s here and there to help with groceries and utilities. But I'd quickly discovered that my clients weren't just buying pretty designs. They were buying my ability to understand their market, position their brand strategically, and create messaging that resonated with their target audience. Word had spread quietly through Austin's business community about the freelancer who could take a struggling company and give them the kind of brand identity that attracted serious investors. As my client list grew and my rates increased, I'd made a strategic decision to keep the full scope of my success private. Ryan had been struggling with his coding bootcamp loans at the time, $45,000 in debt that hung over us like a constant cloud. His confidence was fragile, especially after watching several of his classmates land high-paying developer jobs while he'd had to settle for a mid-level position at TechFlow. I'd convinced myself that revealing my rapidly growing income would only add to his feelings of inadequacy, that it was kinder to let him believe I was simply contributing what I could while he carried the primary financial burden of our household. The truth was more complicated, and I was beginning to realize more problematic. Ryan's identity was deeply tied to being the primary breadwinner, the tech professional married to a sweet woman who dabbled in creative work. He enjoyed introducing me at social gatherings as his artistic wife, always with a fond smile that barely concealed his belief that my work was more hobby than career. He'd never asked to see my portfolio, never inquired about my clients, never shown curiosity about the long hours I spent in my home office. His lack of interest had made it surprisingly easy to compartmentalize my professional life, to let him assume that the financial contributions I made to our household came from small design projects rather than major corporate consulting contracts. By the time Apex Marketing Consultancy had grown large enough to require a downtown Austin office and a small team of employees, I'd been maintaining the fiction for so long that revealing the truth felt impossible. How could I explain that the woman he introduced as a little graphic designer was actually the CEO of a company that had helped launch 3 successful IPOs in the past year alone? How could I tell him that the modest contributions he thought I made to our finances were actually strategic understatements designed to protect his ego? The house we lived in was purchased entirely with my income, though Ryan believed we'd pooled our resources for the down payment. The BMW he drove to work each day was leased through my business, though he assumed it was a stretch purchase we'd made together. Even his coding bootcamp debt, which he dutifully paid down each month with what he thought was careful budgeting, was actually being accelerated through additional payments I made from a separate account. I'd been systematically eliminating his debt while maintaining the illusion that we were barely scraping by, that every financial decision required careful consideration and sacrifice. Standing in my home office that morning, surrounded by the awards and recognition that Ryan had, never seen because they were delivered to my downtown office, I'd felt the weight of my carefully constructed double life more acutely than ever. The proposal in front of me represented more money than Ryan made in an entire year. Yet he would spend the evening introducing me as if my career was a charming afterthought to his own professional identity. I'd walk to my closet to select an outfit for the evening, bypassing the collection of designer pieces I wore to client meetings and industry events in favor of something appropriately modest for the role I played in Ryan's world. The black dress I'd chosen was elegant but understated, expensive enough to meet his standards for how his wife should present herself, but not so obviously costly that it would raise questions about how a little graphic designer could afford such things. As I'd gotten ready that afternoon, applying makeup with the same strategic precision I brought to brand development campaigns, I'd found myself wondering how long I could maintain this careful balance. Ryan's dismissiveness about my work had been tolerable when Apex was just a promising startup, but as my company continued to grow and gain recognition in the industry, his casual diminishment of my achievements had become increasingly difficult to bear. The drive to the Driskill Hotel had been filled with Ryan's excited chatter about the evening ahead, his plans to network with senior developers, and his hopes of finally getting the promotion he'd been pursuing for the past year. He'd barely asked about my day, simply assuming that I'd spent it working on whatever small projects kept me busy while he handled the serious business of building his career. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I'd listened to his enthusiasm with a mixture of affection and frustration, loving his passion for his work, while resenting his inability to recognize that I might have professional aspirations and achievements of my own. The Driskill's Ballroom had been transformed into an elegant showcase of TechFlow's success, with ambient lighting, sophisticated floral arrangements, and a string quartet providing background music as Austin's tech professionals mingled over cocktails and hors d'oeuvres. I'd recognized several faces from the business publications I read religiously, CEOs and entrepreneurs whose companies I'd either worked with or competed against for major contracts. It had been surreal to move through that crowd as Ryan's wife, the little graphic designer, when many of the people in the room would have recognized my name if they'd known my professional identity. Ryan had been in his element, introducing me to his colleagues and supervisors with obvious pride in having such a presentable wife, while simultaneously making it clear that I was not a professional peer. "This is Jessica, my better half. She keeps busy with her art projects while I handle the real tech work." The comments had stung, but I'd maintained my practiced smile, playing the role of the supportive spouse who was grateful to be included in her husband's professional world. The evening had reached its breaking point when Ryan's supervisor, a pompous man named Greg who'd clearly had too much to drink, had made a comment about how refreshing it was to meet a tech wife who wasn't trying to compete with her husband's career. "So many of these tech marriages end in disaster because both spouses think they're hotshots," he'd slurred, gesturing around the room. "It's nice to see someone who knows her place and supports her man instead of trying to outshine him." I'd felt something snap inside me as the men around us nodded in agreement, as if Greg had articulated some profound wisdom about the proper dynamics of marriage. Ryan had beamed at the compliment, clearly pleased that his colleagues viewed our relationship as an example of appropriate gender roles in the tech industry. And that's when he'd decided to make his grand pronouncement, his voice carrying across the elegant ballroom as he called for everyone's attention to introduce his wife, the little graphic designer. The champagne glass had slipped from my numb fingers as I'd stood there, watching the room full of Austin's tech elite smile condescendingly at the quaint little woman who dabbled in art while her husband did the important work of building software. In that moment, surrounded by people who would have fought to hire me if they'd known who I really was, I'd made a decision that would change everything. I'd bent down to carefully pick up the larger pieces of broken crystal, using the moment to compose myself and plan my next move. When I'd straightened up, I'd met Ryan's eyes across the crowd and given him the brightest smile I could manage. "Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, honey," I'd said, my voice carrying just enough to reach the nearby groups of guests. "I'm so grateful to be here tonight, especially since it gives me a chance to meet some of the people I've heard so much about." What Ryan didn't know as he basked in the approving nods of his colleagues was that his little graphic designer wife was about to become the most talked about person at TechFlow's annual gala, and not for the reasons he'd intended. The silence that followed my response stretched for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only seconds. Ryan's confident smile faltered slightly as he processed my words, trying to determine if there was some hidden meaning in my polite acknowledgement of his introduction. The guests around us had already begun to drift back to their conversations, their brief moment of condescending amusement at the tech wife's expense apparently satisfied. What Ryan couldn't have known was that I'd been mentally cataloging every face in that ballroom from the moment we'd arrived, recognizing executives from companies I'd worked with, competitors I'd outmaneuvered, and potential clients I'd been courting for months. The woman he'd just dismissed as a little graphic designer had spent the past hour surrounded by a professional network worth hundreds of millions in combined revenue, all of whom knew my work intimately, even if they'd never met me in person. 3 weeks earlier, I'd received a call from Marcus Chen, the CEO of Innovate Tech, TechFlow's primary competitor in the Austin market. Marcus had been trying to secure my services for months, ever since his head of marketing had seen the transformation I'd orchestrated for CloudSync Solutions, turning them from a struggling local startup into a company that had just closed a $50 million Series B funding round. "Jessica Martinez doesn't just do marketing," he'd told his team during a meeting I'd heard about through industry contacts. "She creates market disruption. Companies don't just hire Apex Marketing. They partner with them for complete strategic overhauls." That phone call had led to a preliminary meeting at my downtown office, where Marcus had outlined his vision for positioning Innovate Tech as the premier alternative to established players like TechFlow. The contract he'd offered was the largest in Apex Marketing's history. A comprehensive 18-month engagement that would include everything from complete brand repositioning to market analysis, competitive intelligence, and the development of a go-to-market strategy for their revolutionary new software platform. The fee structure alone was more than Ryan's annual salary, with performance bonuses that could easily double that amount. I'd accepted the contract that same afternoon, knowing that it would position Apex Marketing as one of the top strategic consulting firms in Texas while simultaneously creating a direct competitive threat to Ryan's employer. The irony had been delicious even then, but I'd pushed aside any concerns about potential conflicts of interest. After all, Ryan had never shown the slightest curiosity about my clients or projects, so the likelihood of him discovering the connection seemed minimal. The preliminary work for the Innovate Tech engagement had consumed most of my time over the past 3 weeks, requiring extensive research into TechFlow's market position, client relationships, and strategic vulnerabilities. I'd conducted detailed analyses of their product offerings, pricing strategies, and corporate messaging, identifying the exact weaknesses that Innovate Tech could exploit to steal market share. The comprehensive report I'd delivered to Marcus the previous Friday had outlined a multi-phase strategy that would systematically undermine TechFlow's competitive advantages while positioning Innovate Tech as the innovative, customer-focused alternative. Standing in that ballroom, surrounded by TechFlow employees who had no idea that their biggest competitor's new strategic advantage was currently being introduced as someone's hobby-pursuing wife, I felt a surge of professional satisfaction, mixed with personal frustration. The cognitive dissonance was almost overwhelming. I was simultaneously the most qualified marketing strategist in the room and the most overlooked person present. Greg, Ryan's supervisor, had apparently decided that his earlier commentary on appropriate spousal dynamics hadn't been condescending enough, because he approached us again with fresh observations about marriage in the tech industry. "You know, Ryan, you're really lucky to have found someone who understands that tech careers require total dedication," he announced, his words slightly slurred from the open bar. "Too many guys in our field end up with wives who want to build their own careers and compete for attention. It never works out." Ryan nodded enthusiastically, clearly pleased to be receiving relationship advice from his supervisor. "Absolutely. Jessica understands that my career has to come first, right? Now, especially with the promotion possibilities opening up. She's incredibly supportive about keeping her work flexible so she can focus on what really matters." The casual dismissal of my entire professional life as something that could be kept flexible hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd heard variations of this sentiment countless times before. What neither Ryan nor Greg realized was that the flexible work they were discussing included a client roster that would have impressed anyone in that room. Beyond Innovate Tech, Apex Marketing currently managed strategic campaigns for 7 major clients, including 2 companies that were preparing for IPO launches, a Fortune 500 corporation expanding into the Texas market, and a tech startup that had been featured on the cover of Inkwell magazine after implementing our recommended growth strategies. The downtown office that Ryan had never visited housed a team of 12 full-time employees, including 3 senior strategists I'd recruited from major consulting firms, a data analytics specialist who'd previously worked for Google, and a creative director whose previous agency had handled campaigns for Apple and Microsoft. The office itself occupied an entire floor of one of Austin's most prestigious business towers, with panoramic views of the city skyline and conference rooms equipped with the latest presentation technology. My personal workspace in that office was a carefully curated environment designed to impress the kind of high-level executives who expected to see success reflected in their consultants' physical surroundings. The custom-designed furniture, original artwork, and state-of-the-art technology created an atmosphere of sophisticated professionalism that had closed more deals than any sales pitch I'd ever delivered. The contrast between that environment and the craft corner where Ryan assumed I spent my days creating simple logos was so stark, it would have been comedic if it weren't so personally painful. As Greg continued his lecture on the proper relationship dynamics for tech professionals, I found myself calculating exactly how much revenue Apex Marketing had generated in the time since Ryan and I had arrived at the party. The hourly rate for my strategic consulting services meant that even this conversation was costing my business money. Though the irony of earning more per hour than most of the people in this room made annually provided some compensation for the irritation. Amanda Chen, a marketing director at TechFlow, whom I'd noticed earlier in the evening, joined our conversation with obvious curiosity about the discussion she'd overheard. "Are you talking about the challenges of dual-career couples in tech?" she asked, directing her question primarily to Greg while glancing politely at me. "It's such an interesting dynamic, especially when both partners are ambitious." Ryan jumped in before I could respond, clearly eager to demonstrate his enlightened approach to marriage. "Well, Jessica isn't really in tech, so we don't have that kind of competition issue," he explained with the tone of someone sharing profound wisdom. "She does graphic design work, mostly small business stuff, so our careers don't overlap at all. It keeps things simple." Amanda nodded thoughtfully, but I caught something in her expression that suggested she was processing this information differently than Ryan intended. "Graphic design can be incredibly strategic," she observed carefully. "Some of the best marketing campaigns start with brilliant visual concepts. Do you work with tech companies at all, Jessica?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon, and I felt Ryan's attention sharpen as he waited for my response. This was the moment I'd been unconsciously preparing for throughout our entire marriage, the inevitable collision between the reality of my professional life and the fiction I'd allowed Ryan to maintain. Amanda's question was innocent enough, but answering it honestly would begin the process of unraveling 6 years of careful deception. "I do work with some technology companies," I replied slowly, choosing my words with the precision I normally reserved for high-stakes client presentations. "The tech industry has unique marketing challenges that require specialized understanding." It was a masterpiece of truthful evasion, technically accurate while revealing nothing about the scope or sophistication of my actual work. Ryan relaxed, visibly, clearly interpreting my response as confirmation of his narrative about small business graphic design work that occasionally included tech startups. Amanda, however, seemed to hear something different in my carefully neutral tone. Her marketing background had apparently trained her to listen for the spaces between words, the strategic omissions that often revealed more than direct statements. "That's fascinating," she continued, her curiosity obviously piqued. "The tech marketing landscape in Austin has become incredibly sophisticated. Some of the strategic consulting work happening here rivals anything in Silicon Valley. Have you seen the kind of transformation campaigns that companies like Apex Marketing are doing? They're completely revolutionizing how tech companies approach market positioning." The mention of my company's name sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system, though I managed to maintain my composed expression. Ryan showed no recognition of the name, confirming once again how completely disconnected he was from the marketing side of the tech industry. Greg nodded vaguely, the kind of non-committal response that suggested he'd heard the name but couldn't place it specifically. "Apex Marketing is definitely making waves," I agreed, my voice carefully neutral. "Their approach to strategic positioning is quite innovative." The understatement was so profound it was almost amusing. I was discussing my own company's revolutionary impact on the industry while standing next to my husband, who remained blissfully unaware that he was married to the firm's founder and CEO. Amanda leaned forward slightly, her professional interest clearly engaged. "I've been following their work since they handled the cloudsync transformation. That campaign was absolutely brilliant, taking a company that was hemorrhaging market share and turning them into the fastest-growing cloud services provider in Texas. That kind of strategic turnaround requires exceptional understanding of market dynamics." I felt a flush of professional pride at the recognition, even as I struggled to maintain the appearance of casual interest rather than personal investment. In the praise. The cloudsync engagement had been one of Apex Marketing's most challenging projects, requiring 18 months of intensive work to completely rebuild their brand identity, restructure their messaging, and develop a market penetration, strategy that had exceeded even our most optimistic projections. Ryan, meanwhile, was beginning to look slightly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. His expertise lay in software development, not marketing strategy, and the increasingly sophisticated discussion of industry trends was clearly outside his comfort zone. "That's all pretty high-level stuff," he interjected with a forced laugh. "Jessica's work is more on the creative side, making things look good rather than all that strategic planning." The dismissal stung more than usual, partly because it was happening in front of someone who clearly understood and appreciated the kind of work I actually did. Amanda's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, and I caught a flicker of something that might have been surprise or confusion. She was obviously trying to reconcile Ryan's description of my work with my demonstrated knowledge of sophisticated marketing strategies. "Creative work and strategic planning often go hand in hand," she replied diplomatically, though her tone suggested she was beginning to question the accuracy of Ryan's characterization. "The best marketing outcomes usually come from campaigns that integrate visual creativity with deep strategic thinking." What Amanda couldn't have known was that her casual mention of Apex marketing had triggered a cascade of memories and associations that were making it increasingly difficult for me to maintain my carefully constructed facade. The cloudsync project she'd praised had consumed 14 months of my life, requiring me to develop expertise in cloud computing technology, conduct extensive market research, and create a comprehensive competitive analysis that had become the blueprint for their successful market repositioning. The success of that campaign had established Apex Marketing's reputation as a firm capable of handling the most complex strategic challenges in the tech industry. The case study we'd developed from the cloudsync transformation had been featured in Harvard Business Review, though the article had focused on the strategic methodology rather than identifying the specific consultants involved. That article had generated dozens of new client inquiries and had ultimately led to the Innovate Tech contract that was currently the centerpiece of our business development strategy. Standing in that ballroom, listening to Amanda describe my work in glowing terms while Ryan continued to characterize it as simple graphic design, I felt the weight of my double life more acutely than ever before. The professional recognition I craved was happening right in front of me, but I couldn't claim it without destroying the carefully maintained fiction that had defined my marriage for 6 years. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of TechFlow's CEO, Michael Rodriguez, who'd been making his way around the ballroom greeting employees and their spouses. He approached our group with the practiced charm of an executive who'd spent years perfecting his networking skills. His attention initially focused on Greg as the senior employee present. "Greg, I hope you're enjoying the evening," Michael said warmly, then turned his attention to Ryan with obvious interest. "And Ryan, congratulations on the Morrison account integration. That was exceptional work." The praise clearly pleased Ryan, who straightened with visible pride at receiving recognition from the company's top executive. Michael's gaze then shifted to me with the polite interest he'd undoubtedly been showing to employee spouses throughout the evening. "And you must be Jessica. Ryan's told me about your creative work. It's always refreshing to meet someone who appreciates the artistic side of business." The patronizing tone was subtle but unmistakable, the kind of condescension that successful men often employed when addressing the wives of their employees. He clearly expected me to respond with grateful appreciation for his acknowledgement of my creative work, to play the role of the charming spouse who was delighted to receive attention from such an important executive. Instead, I found myself studying Michael Rodriguez with the analytical eye I normally reserved for client assessments, noting the expensive suit that suggested success, but not exceptional wealth, the confident posture that came from holding authority within a specific context, and the practiced smile that revealed years of corporate networking. This was a man accustomed to being the most important person in any room, comfortable with the deference that his position commanded from employees and their families. What Michael couldn't have known as he extended his hand for a polite greeting was that I'd spent the past 3 weeks developing a comprehensive strategy designed to systematically undermine his company's market position. The research files in my office contained detailed analyses of TechFlow's weaknesses, client vulnerabilities, and competitive blind spots. I knew more about his business challenges than most of his senior staff, and I was actively working to exploit that knowledge for his primary competitor's benefit. "Thank you for including me this evening," I replied, accepting his handshake with a smile that matched his own practiced charm. "It's fascinating to meet the people Ryan works with. The tech industry in Austin has become incredibly dynamic." Michael nodded approvingly, clearly pleased by my appropriate level of interest, without overstepping into areas that might suggest I had professional opinions about his industry. Austin's tech scene has definitely evolved dramatically over the past few years. We're seeing levels of innovation and competition that rival anything happening in Silicon Valley. The irony of his statement was exquisite. Michael Rodriguez was praising the competitive dynamics that I was actively working to intensify through my strategic consulting for Innovate Tech. He was, in essence, complementing the very market forces that I was helping to orchestrate against his company's interests. Amanda, who had been listening to this exchange with obvious interest, chose that moment to continue her earlier line of inquiry. "Jessica was just sharing some insights about tech marketing strategies," she said, her tone suggesting genuine respect for my opinions. "She seems to have a really sophisticated understanding of the industry." I felt Ryan tense. Beside me, his discomfort obvious as the conversation continued to position me as someone with professional expertise rather than casual interest. Michael's expression shifted slightly, his polite attention sharpening into something more focused as he reassessed his initial assumptions about Ryan's wife. "Marketing strategy is certainly crucial in our industry," Michael agreed, his tone suggesting he was willing to engage with this topic, but expected the conversation to remain at a superficial level appropriate for spousal small talk. "We've been working with some excellent consultants to strengthen our market position." The mention of consultants sent another jolt of adrenaline through my system, though I managed to maintain my composed expression. TechFlow's marketing efforts had been one of the primary focuses of my competitive analysis for Innovate Tech, and I was intimately familiar with their consultant relationships, budget allocations, and strategic priorities. The excellent consultants Michael was referring to included a mid-tier firm from Dallas that charged premium rates for mediocre strategic thinking, and a local agency that specialized in creative execution without deep market understanding. "Consulting relationships can be so valuable," I replied carefully, "especially when you find partners who truly understand your market dynamics and competitive challenges." The statement was innocuous enough on the surface, but it carried subtle implications about the quality of strategic thinking that effective consulting required. Michael nodded enthusiastically, apparently interpreting my comment as appropriate, spousal interest in his business challenges rather than professional insight into his industry. "Exactly. The key is finding consultants who can think strategically rather than just executing tactical campaigns. We need partners who understand that real market impact requires sophisticated analysis and long-term thinking." The description he was offering perfectly matched the services that Apex Marketing provided and that I was currently delivering to his primary competitor. I was the kind of strategic partner he claimed to value, standing directly in front of him while he remained, completely unaware of my professional identity. The cognitive dissonance was almost overwhelming. Ryan, meanwhile, was growing increasingly uncomfortable with the sophisticated nature of the business discussion swirling around him. His expertise in software development was substantial, but marketing strategy was outside his wheelhouse, and he was clearly feeling excluded from a conversation that was supposed to be showcasing his professional network, rather than highlighting his wife's apparent knowledge of industry trends. "Jessica picks up on business stuff pretty quickly," he interjected with a forced casualness that barely concealed his desire to redirect the conversation. "She's always been good at understanding how things work, even if it's not her field." The dismissive tone of his comment was subtle but unmistakable. designed to reestablish the appropriate hierarchy while acknowledging my contributions in a way that didn't threaten his position as the professional expert in our marriage. Michael. And Greg nodded approvingly, clearly comfortable with this characterization of spousal dynamics that maintained proper boundaries while allowing for polite business discussion. Amanda, however, seemed less satisfied with this explanation. Her background in marketing had apparently given her a sensitivity to strategic thinking that transcended gender expectations, and she was obviously processing the disconnect between Ryan's characterization of my casual interest and the sophistication of the insights I'd been sharing. "Strategic thinking is really a gift," she observed, directing her comment to me rather than Ryan. "Some people have an intuitive understanding of market dynamics that goes beyond formal training. It's one of those skills that can't really be taught." The compliment was both personally gratifying and professionally painful. Amanda was recognizing exactly the kind of strategic acumen that had built Apex Marketing's reputation, but she was attributing it to natural talent rather than the years of intensive work, client engagement, and industry study that had actually developed my expertise. She was seeing my capabilities clearly while remaining completely unaware of my credentials. What made the situation even more surreal was that Amanda herself had become a subject of my competitive research for the Innovate Tech engagement. TechFlow's marketing department, which she helped to lead, had been thoroughly analyzed in my reports, their strategies dissected, their weaknesses identified, and their competitive vulnerabilities mapped for Innovate Tech's strategic advantage. I knew more about her professional challenges and departmental priorities than she might have imagined possible. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the evening's entertainment, a jazz quartet that began setting up on the small stage at the far end of the ballroom. The music provided a natural transition away from business discussion, and the group began to disperse as people moved toward the bar or sought out other conversation partners. Michael Rodriguez offered final pleasantries before moving on to greet other employees, his attention already shifting to the next networking opportunity. Greg wandered toward the bar with obvious relief at escaping a marketing discussion that had grown beyond his comfort level. Amanda lingered for a moment, her expression suggesting she had more questions she wanted to ask. But Ryan's body language clearly indicated his desire to move on to different conversations. As Amanda finally drifted away to join a group of her marketing colleagues, Ryan turned to me with an expression that combined pride and mild irritation. "You were really getting into that business talk," he observed, his tone carefully neutral. "I didn't realize you'd been paying so much attention to tech industry stuff." The comment revealed so much about his assumptions and expectations. Ryan genuinely believed that my knowledge of marketing strategy had been acquired through casual observation rather than professional experience, that my insights were the result of spousal proximity to his industry rather than independent expertise. The possibility that I might have my own professional reasons for understanding tech marketing dynamics had apparently never occurred to him. "It's hard not to pick things up when you live with someone in tech," I replied, offering him an explanation that reinforced his preferred narrative while avoiding outright deception. "You hear about industry trends, competitive dynamics, that sort of thing." Ryan relaxed visibly, clearly satisfied with this explanation for my apparent sophistication about business topics. His comfort level was restored by the confirmation that my knowledge was derivative rather than original, acquired through him rather than independent of his influence. What he couldn't have imagined was that my understanding of tech industry dynamics had been developed through years of intensive client work, not casual dinner conversation about his job. The competitive intelligence reports I'd written, the market analyses I'd conducted, and the strategic recommendations I'd delivered to clients had given me insights into the Austin tech scene that went far beyond anything Ryan had ever shared about his work at TechFlow. As we moved through the rest of the evening, I found myself operating on multiple levels of awareness simultaneously. On the surface, I was playing the role of the supportive spouse, making polite conversation with Ryan's colleagues and their wives, asking appropriate questions about their work while sharing just enough about my own activities to maintain the fiction of being a small-time graphic designer. Beneath that performance, however, I was conducting an unofficial market research session, gathering intelligence about TechFlow's culture, priorities, and strategic thinking that would prove invaluable for my work with Innovate Tech. Every conversation provided insights into the company's internal dynamics, management philosophies, and competitive assumptions. I was essentially conducting paid consulting work while attending a social event as Ryan's wife. The dual nature of my engagement with the evening created a constant sense of cognitive dissonance that was both exhausting and professionally exhilarating. I was simultaneously the least and most qualified person in most conversations, the spouse, whose opinions were politely tolerated, and the strategic consultant whose insights could reshape entire market segments. By the time Ryan and I finally left the party, driving home through the quiet streets of Cedar Park in comfortable silence, I felt as though I'd spent the evening living in two completely different realities. The woman who'd chatted pleasantly with TechFlow employees about their work was genuinely the person Ryan had married, someone who cared about his success and enjoyed meeting the people who shared his professional world. But that same woman was also the CEO of Apex Marketing Consultancy, the strategic consultant who'd spent the evening gathering competitive intelligence, while her husband introduced her as a hobbyist who dabbled in graphic design. The contradiction was becoming unsustainable, and I was beginning to realize that something would have to give soon. As we pulled into our driveway, Ryan reached over to squeeze my hand with obvious affection. "Thanks for being such a good sport tonight," he said warmly. "I know these work events aren't always the most exciting, but it means a lot to have you there supporting me." His gratitude was genuine and touching, a reminder of why I'd fallen in love with him in the first place. Ryan was fundamentally a good person who cared about our marriage and appreciated my support for his career. The problem wasn't malicious intent, but rather a complete failure to recognize that I might have my own professional ambitions and achievements worthy of similar support and recognition. "I enjoyed meeting everyone," I replied truthfully, though my reasons for that enjoyment were more complex than he could have imagined. "Your colleagues seem like good people." As we walked into our house together, Ryan chattering about the conversations he'd had and the potential networking opportunities he'd identified, I found myself wondering how much longer I could maintain this careful balance between my authentic, professional identity and the diminished version of myself that my marriage seemed to require. The answer, as it turned out, would be exactly 11 days. The call came at 7:32 in the morning, exactly 11 days after TechFlow's annual gala. I was in my downtown office, reviewing the final draft of Innovate Tech's comprehensive market penetration strategy, when my assistant Lisa's voice came through the intercom with barely contained excitement. "Jessica, you need to see this. Austin Business Journal just published their annual Power Players list, and you're not just on it. You're number 3. The article is already trending on LinkedIn." Her words hit me like lightning, because I knew immediately what this meant. After 3 years of deliberately maintaining a low public profile, carefully avoiding industry publicity while building Apex Marketing's reputation through client results rather than personal branding, my professional identity was about to become impossible to hide. I pulled up the Austin Business Journal website on my computer, and there it was, a full feature article titled, "The Marketing Mastermind You've Never Heard of: How Jessica Martinez Built Austin's Most Influential Strategic Consultancy." The accompanying photograph showed me in my office conference room, taken during an interview I'd given 2 months earlier, when the journalist had promised the piece would focus on industry trends rather than individual profiles. I'd been strategically ambiguous about my personal life during that interview, discussing Apex Marketing's methodology and client success stories while deflecting questions about my background and personal circumstances. The article was comprehensive and devastatingly accurate. It detailed Apex Marketing's client roster, including the Fortune 500 companies I'd helped expand into Texas markets, the tech startups I'd guided through successful IPO preparations, and the established corporations I'd helped navigate major strategic pivots. Most prominently featured was the cloudsync transformation that Amanda Chen had praised at the party, complete with specific metrics about revenue growth, market share expansion, and competitive positioning improvements. But it was the sidebar that made my heart race. Martinez's revolutionary approach to competitive intelligence. The piece described, in glowing terms, exactly the kind of strategic analysis I'd been conducting for Innovate Tech, praising my ability to identify market vulnerabilities and develop systematic approaches to competitive advantage. Any TechFlow employee reading this article would immediately understand that their primary competitor had hired Austin's most effective strategic consultant. My phone started ringing within minutes of the article going live. The first call was from Marcus Chen at Innovate Tech, his voice filled with a mixture of excitement and concern. "Jessica, this is incredible exposure for both of us, but we need to discuss the timing. My board is thrilled about the publicity, but they're asking questions about potential conflicts of interest. Specifically, they want to know if there are any personal connections that could compromise the integrity of our competitive strategy." The irony was almost overwhelming. Marcus was worried about conflicts of interest while remaining completely unaware that his strategic consultant was married to a TechFlow employee. I assured him that all necessary disclosures had been made and that the competitive analysis remained completely objective, which was technically true even as it skirted the more complex reality of my personal situation. The second call came from Patricia Williams, my attorney, who'd been monitoring industry publications as part of her general counsel services for Apex Marketing. "Jessica, this is exactly the kind of visibility we've been working toward, but the timing creates some interesting challenges. Have you considered how this public recognition might affect your personal circumstances?" Patricia knew about my marriage to Ryan, though she'd never commented directly on the compartmentalization I'd maintained between my professional and personal lives. Her legal mind was undoubtedly already calculating the potential ramifications of my sudden public prominence, particularly given Ryan's complete ignorance of my professional achievements. The third call was the one I'd been dreading. Ryan's voice, confused and agitated, cutting through my office's careful calm like a siren. "Jessica, I need you to explain something to me. Someone at work just showed me an article that says you're some kind of major business consultant. There has to be some mistake, because it's talking about companies I've never heard you mention and accomplishments that don't make any sense." His tone carried a mixture of confusion, hurt, and growing anger that told me our carefully maintained fiction was finally collapsing. I could picture him in his cubicle at TechFlow, surrounded by colleagues who were undoubtedly reading the same article and asking questions he couldn't answer about his wife's secret professional identity. "Ryan, I think we should discuss this at home tonight," I replied carefully, aware that Lisa could hear my side of the conversation and that my response would set the tone for how this revelation unfolded. "This isn't really something we should handle over the phone." But Ryan was clearly beyond the point where careful timing and private conversations could contain the situation. "No, Jessica, we're handling this right now. This article says you're the CEO of some major consulting firm. It says you've been working with Fortune 500 companies and managing millions of dollars in client accounts. It says you're one of the most influential marketing strategists in Texas. How is any of that possible when you spend your days in our spare bedroom doing graphic design for small businesses?" The question hung in the air between us, carrying 6 years of assumptions, expectations, and carefully constructed deceptions. I could hear the bewilderment in his voice, the genuine confusion of someone whose entire understanding of his marriage was being challenged by information that didn't fit any framework he'd developed for comprehending our relationship. "The article is accurate," I said simply, deciding that the time for careful management of information had passed. "Apex Marketing Consultancy is my company. I founded it 5 years ago, and it's grown into exactly what that article describes." The silence that followed was profound and terrible. I could almost hear Ryan's mental processes grinding as he tried to reconcile this information with everything he thought he knew about our life together. When he finally spoke again, his voice had changed completely, carrying a flatness that suggested shock, giving way to something harder and more dangerous. So for 5 years, while I've been killing myself trying to advance at TechFlow, worrying about our finances, dealing with my student loan debt, you've been running a multi-million-dollar consulting firm? While I've been introducing you to people, as my wife who does small graphic design projects, you've actually been some kind of business mogul? While I've been feeling guilty about asking you to keep your work flexible so I could focus on my career, you've been managing a client roster that makes my salary look like pocket change. Each question hit like a physical blow, not because they were unfair, but because they were entirely accurate. Ryan was finally seeing the true scope of the deception I'd maintained, and his dawning understanding of how completely I'd misrepresented our circumstances was transforming his confusion into something approaching rage. "Ryan, I can explain the reasons," I began, but he cut me off with a bitter laugh that carried no humor whatsoever. "The reasons? You want to explain the reasons why you've been lying to me about fundamental aspects of our marriage for 5 years? You want to explain why you let me believe we were struggling financially while you were apparently generating enough income to support us both? You want to explain why you let me stress about student loan payments while you were probably making more in a month than I make in a year?" The conversation was spiraling beyond my ability to manage it, partly because Ryan's accusations were fundamentally justified. I had been lying, by omission, if not commission, about essential facts regarding our financial situation and my professional identity. The careful compartmentalization that had seemed strategically wise now looked like systematic deception designed to protect my own interests at his emotional expense. Before I could formulate a response that might begin to address his questions, Ryan continued with a new edge of hurt that cut deeper than his anger. "Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? My colleagues are reading this article right now. They're seeing that my wife, the woman I introduced as a small-time graphic designer 11 days ago, is actually one of the most successful business consultants in Austin. They're realizing that everything I've told them about our marriage, about our financial situation, about our professional dynamic, has been completely wrong." The personal humiliation he was describing was something I'd never fully considered in my strategic calculations. I'd been so focused on protecting his ego from the potential threat of my success that I'd never imagined how much more devastating it would be for him to discover that success through public revelation rather than private disclosure. The very protection I'd thought I was providing had actually amplified the eventual damage exponentially. "And another thing," Ryan continued, his voice gaining momentum as the full implications continued to dawn on him. "If you've been this successful for this long, what exactly have you been doing with all that money? Because it sure hasn't been going toward our joint expenses in any way that I've noticed." The financial question was the one I'd been dreading most, because it would inevitably lead to discoveries that would make the professional deception seem minor by comparison. Ryan was about to learn that virtually every assumption he'd made about our shared financial life had been carefully constructed fiction. Our mortgage, the car payments, most of our major expenses, I've been covering those through the business, I admitted, knowing that this revelation would only deepen his sense of betrayal. I wanted to make sure we were financially secure, without putting pressure on your career development. Another silence, longer and more ominous than the previous ones. When Ryan spoke again, his voice had dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more force than his earlier shouting. "Are you telling me that our house, our cars, our lifestyle, none of that has been supported by my income? You've been funding our entire life while letting me believe I was the primary breadwinner?" The question exposed the heart of the deception, the fundamental dishonesty that had shaped our entire marriage. I'd been so focused on the nobility of my intentions, the desire to protect his confidence and support his career development, that I'd lost sight of how profoundly disrespectful it was to deny him accurate information about his own life circumstances. Ryan, my motivation was never to deceive you or make you feel inadequate. I wanted to give you the space to build your career without financial pressure. Financial pressure? He interrupted, his voice rising again. You think the solution to financial pressure is to lie about our actual financial situation? You think the way to support someone's career development is to let them make decisions based on completely false information about their circumstances? The conversation was interrupted by a knock on my office door. Lisa's voice came through the intercom with obvious urgency. Jessica, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you have 3 reporters holding on different lines, and Amanda Chen from TechFlow is here asking to speak with you immediately. She says it's about competitive intelligence concerns. The mention of Amanda's name sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. If TechFlow's marketing director was at my office asking about competitive intelligence, it meant that someone at the company had connected the dots between the Austin Business Journal article and my current client engagement with Innovate Tech. The careful separation I'd maintained between my professional and personal lives was collapsing on multiple fronts simultaneously. Ryan, I have to handle some urgent business matters, but we need to continue this conversation tonight. There are things about our financial situation that you need to understand. Things about our financial situation? He cut me off, his voice now carrying a dangerous edge. Jessica, I'm beginning to think there are things about our entire marriage that I need to understand. This isn't just about money or your career. This is about the fact that I apparently don't know who I'm married to. The line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone while processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. In the space of a single conversation, 6 years of careful compartmentalization had collapsed into bitter recrimination and mutual accusations. Ryan was right to feel betrayed, and I was beginning to understand that my strategic approach to managing our relationship had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. But there was no time to process the personal implications, because Amanda Chen was sitting in my reception area asking questions about competitive intelligence, and that conversation would determine whether my professional reputation survived the collision between my hidden marriage and my public career. I straightened my blazer, checked my appearance in the office mirror, and prepared to transition from the personal crisis that was destroying my marriage to the professional crisis that could destroy my business. The woman who walked out to meet Amanda Chen was the CEO of Apex Marketing Consultancy, fully prepared to defend her company's integrity and client relationships, while somewhere inside, Jessica Martinez was beginning to reckon with the wreckage of her carefully constructed double life. Amanda was waiting in the reception area, her professional demeanor intact, but her expression carrying the intensity of someone who'd connected troubling dots and needed immediate answers. She stood as I approached, extending her hand with practiced courtesy, while her eyes conveyed the seriousness of her mission. Jessica, thank you for seeing me on such short notice. I think we need to discuss some concerns that have arisen regarding your current client engagements and their potential impact on TechFlow's competitive position. Her directness was admirable and terrifying in equal measure because it suggested she already knew exactly what questions she needed to ask. We moved to my office conference room, the same space where I'd hosted dozens of client meetings and strategic planning sessions, now repurposed for what amounted to a professional interrogation. Amanda declined my offer of coffee, choosing instead to open her tablet and display what appeared to be a comprehensive research document. The Austin Business Journal article was illuminating in many ways, she began, her tone remaining professionally neutral, while her implications became increasingly pointed. It highlighted Apex Marketing's impressive client roster and strategic capabilities. What it didn't mention, however, were the specific companies you're currently working with or the nature of those engagements. I maintained my composure while recognizing that Amanda was approaching this conversation with the systematic thoroughness that had made her successful in her marketing role. She wasn't making accusations, but rather building a case through careful inquiry, allowing me to provide information that would either confirm or refute her suspicions. Client confidentiality is obviously a crucial aspect of our business model, I replied carefully. We maintain strict protocols regarding the disclosure of engagement details, particularly when those engagements involve competitive strategy, work. Amanda nodded as if she'd expected exactly that response. Of course, client confidentiality is essential in strategic consulting, which makes it particularly interesting that Innovate Tech's CEO was quoted in this morning's Tech Austin newsletter praising their new strategic marketing partnership. He specifically mentioned working with a consultant who specializes in competitive, intelligence, and market disruption strategies. The connection she was drawing was becoming impossible to deny, and I realized that Amanda had done her homework thoroughly before coming to my office. She wasn't fishing for information, but rather confirming details she'd already pieced together through industry research and logical deduction. Innovate Tech is indeed a client of Apex Marketing, I confirmed, seeing no benefit in continued evasion. We're providing strategic consultation regarding their market positioning and growth strategy. Amanda's expression didn't change, but I caught a subtle shift in her posture that suggested my confirmation had validated her suspicions. Market positioning and growth strategy against which competitors, specifically? The question hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Amanda knew the answer before she asked it, and we both understood that my response would determine whether this conversation remained a professional inquiry or escalated into something more serious. Our competitive analysis encompasses the entire Austin tech landscape, I replied, choosing my words with extreme care. Innovate Tech operates in a competitive environment that includes multiple established players. It was a masterpiece of strategic evasion, technically accurate while avoiding direct confirmation of TechFlow's position as the primary target of my strategic recommendations. But Amanda was far too experienced to be satisfied with such carefully crafted non-answers. Jessica, I'm going to be direct with you, because I think this situation requires clarity rather than diplomatic language. TechFlow is Innovate Tech's primary competitor in virtually every market segment we serve. Any strategic consultation that enhances Innovate Tech's competitive position necessarily impacts TechFlow's market share and business prospects. Given that relationship, I need to understand whether there are any potential conflicts of interest that could compromise the integrity of your strategic recommendations. The moment of truth had arrived, delivered with professional courtesy but unmistakable force. Amanda was giving me an opportunity to disclose my marriage to Ryan voluntarily, to address the conflict of interest directly rather than forcing her to discover it through other means. The choice I made in the next few seconds would determine not only the future of my client relationship with Innovate Tech, but potentially my reputation throughout Austin's business community. I took a deep breath, recognizing that my careful compartmentalization strategy had finally reached its inevitable conclusion. There is something you should know about my personal circumstances that could be relevant to your concerns. I'm married to Ryan Thompson, who works in TechFlow's development department. Amanda's composure was impressive, but I caught the slight widening of her eyes that indicated genuine surprise despite her obvious suspicions. She'd come to my office expecting to uncover a conflict of interest, but she hadn't anticipated that the conflict would be this direct and personal. I see, she said after a moment, her tone remaining professional while her mind was clearly racing through the implications. How long have you been married to Mr. Thompson? 6 years, I replied, recognizing that every detail I provided would be used to assess the scope and significance of the conflict. He's been employed at TechFlow for approximately 4 years. Amanda made notes on her tablet, her questions becoming more systematic as she shifted into investigative mode. During your engagement with Innovate Tech, has your husband shared any confidential information about TechFlow's strategic plans, client relationships, or competitive positioning? The question struck at the heart of my professional integrity, and I was grateful to be able to answer it with complete honesty. Absolutely not. Ryan has never discussed TechFlow's confidential business information with me, and I've never sought such information from him. Our conversations about his work have been limited to general topics like project timelines and office dynamics. This was entirely true, partly because Ryan had never shown interest in discussing strategic business matters with me, preferring to keep his work conversations focused on technical challenges and interpersonal workplace issues. His assumption that I lacked the business sophistication to understand or appreciate strategic discussions had actually protected both of us from potential conflicts of interest. Amanda's expression suggested she found my answer credible, but her next question indicated she was far from satisfied with the scope of the disclosure. Has your strategic analysis for Innovate Tech included any information that could only have been obtained through access to TechFlow's internal operations or confidential business data? Again, I was able to respond with complete honesty. All competitive intelligence included in our strategic recommendations for Innovate Tech has been derived from publicly available sources, industry analysis, and standard market research methodologies. No confidential or proprietary information has been accessed or utilized. This was accurate because my research methodology relied heavily on public filings, industry publications, client testimonials, and market analysis rather than inside information. The competitive advantages I'd identified for Innovate Tech were based on TechFlow's public positioning and observable market behavior, not confidential strategic plans or internal operational details. But Amanda was clearly building toward a more fundamental question about professional ethics and disclosure obligations. When you accepted the Innovate Tech engagement, did you inform them of your marriage to a TechFlow employee? This question struck at the heart of my ethical failure, and I found myself unable to provide an answer that didn't expose serious lapses in professional judgment. The conflict of interest was not disclosed at the time the engagement was initiated. Amanda nodded slowly, as if my answer had confirmed her expectations while disappointing her professional standards. So, Innovate Tech has been paying premium consulting fees for competitive strategy development, without knowing that their consultant is married to an employee of their primary competitor? The stark framing of the situation made clear how serious my ethical failure had been. Regardless of my intentions or the integrity of my analysis, I had accepted a consulting engagement that involved a clear conflict of interest without providing appropriate disclosure to my client. The fact that I'd maintained complete professional integrity in my research and recommendations didn't excuse the failure to address the conflict transparently from the beginning. You're correct, I admitted, recognizing that evasion or justification would only compound the ethical problems. The conflict should have been disclosed when the engagement was initiated. Amanda set down her tablet and looked at me directly, her expression conveying disappointment rather than anger. Jessica, I want to be clear about something. This conversation isn't about your professional competence or the quality of your strategic analysis. Everything I've heard about Apex Marketing's work suggests that you're exceptionally skilled at what you do. This is about professional ethics and the integrity of competitive intelligence in our industry. Her point was well taken and entirely fair. My professional reputation was being questioned not because of incompetence, but because of ethical failures that undermine trust in the consulting process. The damage to my credibility would be based on integrity concerns rather than performance issues, which in many ways made the situation more serious rather than less. I understand your concerns completely, I replied, and I take full responsibility for the failure to disclose the conflict of interest appropriately. What would you like to see happen to address the situation? Amanda consulted her notes before responding, her approach suggesting she'd already developed a clear plan for resolving the ethical issues. First, Innovate Tech needs to be informed immediately about the conflict of interest and given the opportunity to decide whether they want to continue the engagement with appropriate safeguards or terminate the relationship. Second, any strategic recommendations that have already been delivered need to be reviewed to ensure they don't contain information that could have been influenced by the undisclosed conflict. Both requirements were reasonable and necessary, though implementing them would likely result in the termination of my largest current client engagement and potential damage to Apex Marketing's reputation throughout Austin's business community. The financial impact would be significant, but the reputational consequences could be far more damaging to my long-term business prospects. I'll contact Marcus Chen immediately to schedule a disclosure meeting, I agreed. Innovate Tech deserves complete transparency about the circumstances, and they need to make their own decision about how to proceed. Amanda seemed satisfied with my commitment to address the ethical issues directly, but her final question indicated that she was also concerned about the broader implications for competitive integrity in Austin's tech industry. One more thing. Jessica. Going forward, how do you plan to handle potential conflicts of interest in your consulting practice? This situation suggests that your current disclosure protocols may need to be strengthened. The question forced me to confront the reality that my carefully compartmentalized approach to managing personal and professional relationships had created systemic problems that went beyond this specific engagement. If Apex Marketing was going to maintain its reputation and continue serving clients in Austin's interconnected business community, I needed to develop more robust conflict identification and disclosure procedures. You're absolutely right, I acknowledged. This situation has exposed weaknesses in our conflict assessment protocols that need to be addressed immediately. We'll be implementing enhanced disclosure procedures and conflict identification systems to prevent similar issues from arising in the future. Amanda gathered her materials and stood to leave, her professional demeanor intact, but her expression suggesting that our conversation had achieved her primary objectives. I appreciate your candor about the situation, Jessica. How you handle the disclosure to Innovate Tech and the implementation of improved ethical protocols will go a long way toward determining how this affects your reputation in our business community. As she prepared to leave, Amanda paused at the conference room door with what appeared to be a personal observation rather than a professional comment. For what it's worth, I think your husband is going to have some difficult adjustments to make. Finding out about your professional success through a newspaper article rather than direct communication couldn't have been easy for him. Her comment reminded me that while I'd been focused on managing the professional crisis Amanda's visit represented, Ryan was dealing with the personal crisis of discovering that his understanding of our marriage had been fundamentally inaccurate. The collision between my hidden professional identity and my carefully maintained personal persona was creating simultaneous disasters in both spheres of my life. After Amanda left, I sat alone in my conference room contemplating the wreckage of my carefully constructed double life. In the span of a few hours, the Austin Business Journal article had triggered a cascade of revelations that were dismantling every compartment I'd built to keep my professional and personal identities separate. Ryan was questioning the fundamental honesty of our marriage. Amanda was questioning the ethical integrity of my business practices, and Marcus Chen at Innovate Tech was about to learn that his strategic consultant had been operating under a significant, undisclosed conflict of interest. The irony was that my success at building Apex Marketing into a respected strategic consultancy was now threatening to destroy both my marriage and my professional reputation. The very achievements I'd hidden to protect Ryan's confidence were becoming the evidence of deception that could end our relationship, while the client success I'd built through careful analysis and strategic thinking was being overshadowed by ethical failures that could damage my credibility throughout Austin's business community. My phone buzzed with a text message from Ryan that carried an ominous simplicity. Coming home early today. We need to talk about everything. The message suggested that his initial shock and anger were crystallizing into something more determined and potentially more dangerous. Ryan had apparently moved beyond confusion and hurt into a more systematic assessment of our relationship and his future options. As I prepared to call Marcus Chen and initiate what would undoubtedly be the most difficult client conversation of my career, I realized that the careful compartmentalization I'd maintained for 6 years was finally collapsing completely. The woman who had built a successful consulting business through strategic thinking and careful planning, was about to discover that some problems couldn't be solved through professional competence and systematic analysis. The reckoning I'd been avoiding through years of careful deception was finally beginning, and there was no strategic framework sophisticated enough to manage the simultaneous destruction of both my marriage and my professional reputation. For the first time in my career, I was facing challenges that couldn't be solved through better planning or more careful execution. I was about to discover what happened when strategic thinking collided with the messy reality of human relationships and ethical accountability. The parking garage beneath my downtown office building had never felt more like a refuge than it did at 6:15 that evening. I sat in my BMW, hands gripping the steering wheel while contemplating the drive home to Cedar Park and the conversation that awaited me there. The call with Marcus Chen had gone exactly as anticipated, professionally. Devastating but ethically necessary. After 45 minutes of careful explanation about the undisclosed conflict of interest, Innovate Tech had terminated their engagement with Apex Marketing effective immediately, requesting a full refund of fees paid to date and threatening legal action if any confidential strategic recommendations were shared with TechFlow. The financial impact was staggering. The Innovate Tech contract had represented nearly 30% of Apex Marketing's annual revenue, and losing it would require immediate restructuring of operations, potential staff reductions, and a complete reassessment of our growth projections. But the reputational damage was far worse. Marcus had made it clear that Innovate Tech would be sharing details of the ethical breach with other Austin business leaders, effectively blacklisting Apex Marketing from future engagements with any company that valued integrity in their consulting relationships. My phone had been ringing constantly throughout the afternoon, with calls from industry colleagues, competitors, and journalists who'd connected the dots between the Austin Business Journal article and the rapidly spreading rumors about professional misconduct. Lisa had fielded dozens of inquiries, declining interview requests and promising callbacks that I had no intention of making. The story was developing its own momentum, feeding on the inherent drama of a successful consultant whose hidden marriage had compromised her professional ethics. The drive home through Austin's rush hour traffic gave me 40 minutes to prepare for what I knew would be the most difficult conversation of my marriage. Ryan's earlier phone call had revealed hurt and anger, but his text messages throughout the afternoon had suggested something more dangerous, calculated assessment rather than emotional reaction. His messages had grown shorter and more pointed as the day progressed, culminating in a final text that simply read, "Lawyers called back. Meeting set for tomorrow morning." The mention of lawyers sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the evening temperature. Ryan had apparently moved beyond processing his hurt feelings into taking concrete action to protect his interests, which suggested he was already contemplating divorce rather than reconciliation. The speed of his transition from shocked spouse to strategic adversary was both impressive and terrifying, indicating that his capacity for decisive action had been underestimated, along with everything else about our relationship dynamics. I pulled into our driveway to find Ryan's car already there, which was unusual since he typically worked until 7 or 8 in the evening. The early arrival suggested he'd left TechFlow as soon as possible to begin dealing with the personal crisis that my professional revelation had created. Through the front windows, I could see lights on throughout the house, another departure from our normal routine that indicated the extraordinary nature of the evening ahead. Ryan met me at the front door with an expression I'd never seen before, a combination of determination and disappointment that made him look older and somehow more substantial than the man who'd introduced me as a little graphic designer 11 days earlier. He'd changed out of his work clothes into jeans and a casual shirt, but his posture carried a formality that suggested he was treating this conversation as seriously as any business negotiation. "We need to discuss some practical matters," Inspa said without preamble, stepping aside to let me enter our home. "I've spent the day reviewing our financial situation, and there are some things that don't add up with what you told me this morning." His tone was controlled and businesslike, lacking the emotional heat I'd expected after his earlier phone call. The shift suggested he'd spent the afternoon moving through anger into analytical mode, approaching our marriage crisis with the same systematic thinking he brought to software development projects. It was a side of Ryan I'd rarely seen, and I found myself reassessing his capabilities just as he was reassessing mine. Ryan, before we get into specific details, I want you to understand that none of this was intended to hurt you or diminish your contributions to our life together, I began, but he raised a hand to stop me with a gesture that was both polite and final. Jessica, I've had 8 hours to think about intentions and motivations, and I've concluded that they're not really relevant to the practical questions we need to address tonight. What matters now is establishing an accurate understanding of our actual circumstances so we can make informed decisions about how to proceed. The clinical approach caught me off guard, though I recognized the logic behind it. Ryan had apparently decided that emotional processing could wait until after the factual foundation of our relationship had been properly examined. His methodical approach was probably the most effective way to handle the magnitude of revelations that needed to be addressed, even if it felt coldly transactional. We sat in our living room, the comfortable space we'd shared for 3 years suddenly feeling like a conference room where adversaries met to negotiate terms. Ryan had prepared for this conversation with characteristic thoroughness, spreading documents across our coffee table that included bank statements, tax returns, mortgage papers, and insurance policies, a comprehensive audit of our shared financial life. "Let's start with the house," he said, pulling out the deed and mortgage documents. "You said this morning that you've been covering the mortgage payments through your business. I reviewed our bank records, and you're right. The monthly transfers. I thought we're going to mortgage payments have actually been going to a separate account that I apparently don't have access to." His discovery was accurate, but incomplete. The mortgage had been paid off 18 months earlier through a lump sum payment from Apex Marketing's operating account, but I'd continued the monthly transfers to a savings account to maintain the illusion that we were still making payments. The deception had seemed reasonable at the time, a way to avoid questions about sudden changes in our financial obligations, but now it looked like systematic dishonesty designed to obscure the true scope of my financial resources. The mortgage was actually paid off in full last year, I admitted, knowing that this revelation would add another layer to his growing understanding of how completely I'd misrepresented our financial situation. I maintained the appearance of monthly payments to avoid disrupting our budget planning. Ryan's expression didn't change, but he made a note on the legal pad he'd placed beside the financial documents. His reaction suggested he was building a comprehensive picture rather than responding to individual revelations, approaching our marriage like a complex problem that required systematic analysis before solutions could be developed. "So, the house is owned free and clear, and it's solely in your name," he continued, consulting the deed documents. "What about the cars? My BMW and your Audi. How are those actually financed?" The vehicle situation was even more complicated than the house, because it involved business assets being used for personal purposes, creating tax implications and ownership questions that Ryan couldn't have anticipated. Both cars were technically owned by Apex Marketing and provided to us as executive benefits, though Ryan had never been informed of this arrangement. "Both vehicles are owned by the business," I explained, watching his expression carefully as another assumption about our shared assets was corrected. "They're provided as executive benefits, which offers certain tax advantages while ensuring reliable transportation for both of us." Ryan added this information to his growing list, his systematic approach continuing despite what must have been an overwhelming series of discoveries about the true nature of our financial arrangements. His capacity to process these revelations, methodically rather than emotionally, was actually impressive, suggesting depths of character that I'd underestimated during our marriage. "What about our investment accounts? The retirement planning we've been doing together? The emergency fund we've been building? What's the actual status of those assets?" This question struck at the heart of my most significant deception, because it involved money that Ryan believed he'd contributed through careful budgeting and sacrifice. The investment portfolio he thought we'd built together through modest monthly contributions was actually funded entirely through my business income, with his supposed contributions being redirected to the separate savings account that maintained the illusion of ongoing mortgage payments. The investment accounts are substantially larger than you've been told, I said carefully, knowing that this revelation would be particularly painful because it involved funds he thought he'd helped to accumulate through his own financial discipline. Your contributions have been going to savings rather than investments, while the portfolio growth has come from business income. For the first time that evening, Ryan's controlled demeanor cracked slightly, revealing the emotional impact of discovering that even his attempts at financial responsibility had been redirected without his knowledge. The investment portfolio had been a source of pride for him, evidence that his careful budgeting and long-term thinking were building security for our future together. Learning that his contributions had been essentially meaningless struck at his sense of partnership in our marriage. "How much?" he asked simply, his voice carrying a new edge of hurt beneath the businesslike tone. I pulled out my phone and accessed the portfolio management app, turning the screen toward him to display the current balance. The number that appeared was larger than his annual salary, representing years of strategic investment growth that he'd believed was the result of their shared financial discipline. Ryan stared at the screen for a long moment, processing the magnitude of the deception involved in letting him believe his modest contributions had helped build such substantial wealth. When he finally looked up, his expression had hardened in a way that suggested our conversation was moving from difficult disclosure into something approaching interrogation. "Jessica, I need you to help me understand something. If you've been generating enough income to pay off our mortgage, buy our cars, and build a six-figure investment portfolio, what exactly did you think you were accomplishing by hiding all of this from me? What possible benefit could there have been to letting me stress about finances while you were apparently rich enough to support us both without any concerns?" The question demanded an honest answer about motivations I'd never fully examined, psychological dynamics I'd been reluctant to acknowledge even to myself. The truth was complicated and unflattering, involving assumptions about Ryan's emotional capacity, calculations about relationship stability, and strategic decisions about power dynamics that I was embarrassed to admit even now. "I was trying to protect your confidence during a vulnerable period in your career development," I began, knowing the explanation would sound inadequate, but needing to offer some account of my reasoning. "When you were struggling with your job, search after the coding bootcamp, dealing with student loan debt, and watching classmates advance faster than you were, I thought additional financial pressure would be counterproductive." Ryan listened to my explanation with an expression that suggested he was evaluating my words for logical consistency rather than emotional sincerity. His analytical approach was making it impossible to rely on appeals to good intentions or relationship history to mitigate the impact of my systematic deception. "So your solution to my struggling with confidence was to lie to me about fundamental aspects of our shared life? Your way of supporting my career development was to make sure I never had accurate information about our actual circumstances?" His voice remained controlled, but the questions carried an edge of incredulity that suggested he found my rationale both inadequate and offensive. The conversation was interrupted by the doorbell, followed immediately by a knock that was both polite and insistent. Ryan glanced toward the front door with obvious annoyance at the interruption, then rose to answer it, while I remained on the couch surrounded by the financial documents that had been systematically dismantling 6 years of carefully constructed fiction. Through the living room windows, I could see a news van parked across the street, and my heart sank as I realized that our private reckoning was about to become a public spectacle. The combination of the Austin Business Journal article, the business ethics scandal, and the human interest angle of a marriage built on professional deception had apparently attracted media attention that would make managing this crisis exponentially more difficult. Ryan returned from the front door with a business card and an expression of barely controlled frustration. There's a reporter from Austin Business Weekly asking for interviews about your consulting practice and its impact on local industry competition. She says there are questions about potential insider trading violations related to your access to confidential corporate information. The mention of insider trading sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with media attention. If journalists were investigating potential securities violations, it meant that someone had suggested my marriage to Ryan might have provided access to material non-public information about TechFlow that could have influenced my strategic recommendations to innovate tech. The allegation was unfounded. Ryan had never shared confidential business information with me, but proving the absence of insider trading would require extensive investigation and documentation. Ryan, I want to be absolutely clear about this because it could affect both of us. You've never shared any confidential information about TechFlow's business operations, strategic plans, or financial performance with me. Our conversations about your work have been limited to general topics that couldn't be considered material, non-public information. My statement was completely accurate, but Ryan's expression suggested he was beginning to understand that his inadvertent role in my professional life might have legal implications beyond the personal betrayal we'd been discussing. The possibility that our marriage could be investigated for securities violations added a new dimension of complexity to what was already an overwhelming crisis. The reporter also said something about TechFlow considering legal action related to competitive intelligence breaches. Ryan continued, his voice taking on a new note of concern. She wanted to know if I'd ever provided you with information about client contracts, development timelines, or strategic partnerships. The legal threat from TechFlow was more serious than media speculation about insider trading because it involved concrete business relationships and verifiable damages. If TechFlow decided to pursue legal action, claiming that my strategic work for Innovate Tech had been enhanced by confidential information obtained through my marriage, both Apex, marketing, and Ryan himself could face significant legal liability. Before I could respond to Ryan's latest revelation, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from Patricia Williams, my attorney. Her timing suggested she'd been monitoring the developing media attention and recognized the need for immediate legal consultation to address the escalating crisis. Jessica, I've been fielding calls from reporters and business colleagues all afternoon, and I think we need to meet immediately to discuss damage control strategies, Patricia said without preamble. When I answered, the story is developing beyond professional ethics into potential legal liability, and we need to get ahead of it before more serious allegations emerge. The need for immediate legal consultation confirmed that my carefully compartmentalized life had collapsed into a crisis that threatened both my personal relationships and my professional survival. The revelation of my true identity had triggered a cascade of consequences that was spiraling beyond my ability to manage through strategic thinking or careful communication. Patricia, I'm in the middle of a crucial conversation with Ryan about our personal circumstances, but I understand the urgency of the legal issues. Can we schedule something for early tomorrow morning? Actually, I think Ryan should be included in the legal consultation, Patricia replied, her tone suggesting she'd already assessed the scope of potential liability. If there are going to be allegations about confidential information sharing, he needs legal representation to protect his own interests, which may not align with protecting Apex Marketing's interests. The suggestion that Ryan might need independent legal counsel drove home the reality that our marriage crisis was evolving into something more serious and more permanent than emotional reconciliation could address. We were potentially becoming adversaries in legal proceedings rather than spouses working through relationship difficulties. Ryan had been listening to my side of the phone conversation, and his expression suggested he understood the implications of needing separate legal representation. The businessman who'd emerged during our financial discussion was now calculating the personal risks of being married to someone whose professional conduct was under investigation. After I ended the call with Patricia, Ryan and I sat in silence. For several minutes, surrounded by financial documents and contemplating the wreckage of our shared life. The systematic analysis of our finances had revealed the scope of my deception, but the legal complications were transforming our personal crisis into something that might require formal resolution rather than private reconciliation. Jessica, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me honestly, Ryan said finally, his voice carrying a gravity that suggested the question would be crucial to his decision-making process. Setting aside all the financial deception and the professional lies, do you actually love me? Not the version of me that you thought needed protection or management, but the actual person sitting here right now? The question cut through all the strategic considerations and practical complications to the emotional core of our relationship. Ryan was asking whether our marriage had been built on genuine affection or had been primarily a convenient arrangement that allowed me to maintain my preferred lifestyle while pursuing my professional ambitions. The honest answer was complicated in ways that were difficult to articulate without causing additional hurt. I did love Ryan, but I loved a version of him that I'd shaped through careful management of information and circumstances. The man sitting across from me, asking direct questions and taking decisive action to protect his interests, was someone I was just beginning to know after 6 years of marriage. I love you, but I'm realizing that I may not have respected you enough to let you make informed decisions about our life together, I replied, choosing honesty over diplomatic evasion. I thought I was protecting you, but I can see now that I was actually controlling you by managing your access to information about our circumstances. Ryan nodded slowly, as if my answer had confirmed something he'd been considering throughout our conversation. His response suggested that he'd moved beyond hurt and anger into a more fundamental reassessment of our relationship and his future options. I think we both need time to figure out who we actually are as individuals before we can determine whether we have a marriage worth saving, he said with a finality that suggested he'd already made some preliminary decisions about our future. I'm going to stay at my brother's place for a while. We can figure out the legal and financial details once we both have clearer perspectives on what we want. The announcement that he was leaving wasn't entirely surprising, but the calm decisiveness of his statement indicated that this wasn't an emotional reaction, but a strategic choice made after careful consideration. Ryan had apparently concluded that separation was necessary for both practical and psychological reasons, recognizing that reconciliation would require rebuilding our relationship from entirely new foundations. As he gathered his laptop and some personal items for an extended stay away from our house, I found myself watching a version of Ryan I'd never seen before. Decisive, self-protective, and unwilling to accept convenient explanations for complex problems. The man who was walking out of our marriage was substantially more impressive than the one I'd thought I was protecting through 6 years of careful deception. The irony wasn't lost on me that my efforts to shield Ryan from challenges had prevented me from seeing his actual capabilities for handling adversity. The professional crisis that was destroying my business reputation was also revealing that my husband possessed strengths I'd never recognized because I'd never given him opportunities to demonstrate them. After Ryan left for his brother's house, I sat alone in our living room contemplating the complete collapse of my carefully constructed double life. The financial documents spread across our coffee table told the story of systematic deception that had undermined trust so thoroughly that reconciliation might be impossible. The business cards from reporters and lawyers represented professional consequences that could destroy both my marriage and my career simultaneously. For the first time in my professional life, I was facing problems that couldn't be solved through strategic planning, careful analysis, or sophisticated execution. The success I'd built through compartmentalization and information management had created a crisis that demanded transparency and accountability, qualities that directly contradicted the methods I'd used to achieve that success. The woman who had built Apex Marketing Consultancy through strategic thinking and systematic deception was about to discover whether those same skills could help her rebuild a life based on honesty and authentic relationships. The reckoning I'd been avoiding through years of careful compartmentalization was finally beginning, and there was no strategic framework sophisticated enough to manage the simultaneous destruction of everything I'd worked to build. 18 months later, I stood in the lobby of the Four Seasons Hotel Austin, adjusting my navy blue suit jacket while waiting for the elevator that would take me to the Texas Business Leadership Summit's annual awards ceremony. The invitation in my purse represented something I'd never thought possible during the darkest days following the collapse of my marriage and the near destruction of my consulting practice. Recognition as Austin's small business comeback story. Of the year, the months immediately following Ryan's departure had been the most challenging period of my professional and personal life. The legal investigations into potential insider trading had ultimately found no evidence of wrongdoing, but the process had consumed 6 months and cost Apex Marketing 3 additional major clients who couldn't afford the association with ongoing controversy. The business that had once employed 12 people and occupied an entire floor of downtown office space had been reduced to 4 employees working from a smaller suite in a less prestigious building. But the forced downsizing had also created unexpected opportunities for authentic growth. Without the pressure to maintain an impressive facade or the distraction of managing a complicated double life, I'd been able to focus on rebuilding Apex, marketing with a foundation of complete transparency and ethical clarity. The new client screening process included comprehensive conflict of interest assessments, and all engagement letters now contained detailed disclosure requirements that ensured no future ethical lapses. The elevator doors opened to reveal Amanda Chen, impeccably dressed and carrying herself with the confidence of someone whose professional instincts had been thoroughly validated. Our eyes met with the complex recognition of former adversaries who'd developed mutual respect through difficult circumstances. "Jessica," she said warmly, stepping aside to make room in the elevator. "I heard about the award tonight. Congratulations on the recognition. It's well-deserved after everything you've rebuilt." Her genuine pleasure at my success was both surprising and deeply gratifying. Amanda had been instrumental in exposing the ethical failures that nearly destroyed my business, but she'd also been one of the first industry colleagues to publicly acknowledge Apex Marketing's commitment to reformed practices when we'd begun rebuilding our reputation. "Thank you, Amanda. That means more coming from you than you might realize," I replied as the elevator climbed toward the ballroom level. "Your professional integrity during that whole situation set a standard that I've tried to meet ever since." The conversation that followed revealed how much both of our professional circumstances had evolved since our confrontation in my conference room. Amanda had been promoted to Vice President of Strategic Marketing at TechFlow, largely based on her handling of the competitive intelligence crisis and her subsequent development of industry-leading ethical protocols for vendor relationships. "Actually, there's something I wanted to discuss with you if you have time after the ceremony," Amanda said as we approached the ballroom. TechFlow is launching a new division focused on ethical business practices consulting, and we're looking for an external partner who understands both the strategic challenges and the integrity requirements. Your rebuilt practice would be perfect for what we're trying to accomplish. The irony was exquisite and somewhat overwhelming. The company whose competitive position I'd inadvertently compromised through my ethical failures was now considering hiring my rebuilt consulting practice specifically because of the reforms I'd implemented in response to that crisis. Amanda was essentially offering me the opportunity to transform my greatest professional failure into a new area of business development. "I'd be very interested in discussing that possibility," I replied, meaning it more than I'd expected. The work we've done developing ethical frameworks for competitive intelligence has been some of the most rewarding consulting I've ever undertaken. As we entered the elegant ballroom, I scanned the crowd of Austin's business elite, noting faces I recognized from the industry publications and networking events that had become central to rebuilding my professional reputation. The difference between this gathering and TechFlow's annual gala 18 months earlier was profound. I was attending as myself, with no hidden identity or compartmentalized professional life to maintain. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick, The first 6 months after Ryan's departure had been consumed with legal consultations, client retention efforts, and the painful process of downsizing operations to match our reduced revenue. Patricia Williams had guided me through the complexities of separating my personal assets from business operations, ensuring that the house and investment portfolio were properly documented as personal property rather than business assets that could be affected by potential litigation. The divorce proceedings had been surprisingly amicable, partly because Ryan's systematic approach to understanding our financial situation had eliminated most of the ambiguity that typically fueled contentious separations. His attorney had negotiated a modest settlement that acknowledged his contributions to our shared life, while recognizing that the major assets had been funded through my business income. The process had been completed within 8 months, faster than either of us had expected. But the most significant change had been personal rather than professional or legal. Living alone in the Cedar Park house for the first time in 6 years had forced me to confront aspects of my personality and relationship patterns that I'd been avoiding through careful compartmentalization. Without the constant management of information and circumstances that had defined my marriage, I'd been able to examine my motivations more honestly and develop healthier approaches to professional relationships. The award ceremony began with a video presentation highlighting the stories of small businesses that had overcome significant challenges to rebuild and thrive. When my segment appeared on the large screens flanking the stage, I watched with a mixture of pride and residual embarrassment as the narrator described Apex Marketing's journey from ethical crisis to industry leadership in transparent business practices. Jessica Martinez faced the kind of scandal that destroys most consulting firms permanently, the narrator explained over footage of my rebuilt office space and interviews with current clients. Instead of making excuses or minimizing her mistakes, she used the crisis as an opportunity to completely reimagine how strategic consulting could be conducted with absolute ethical clarity. Today, Apex Marketing's conflict of interest protocols are being studied and copied by consulting firms across Texas. The recognition was gratifying, but what made it genuinely meaningful was knowing that the success being celebrated was authentic, rather than carefully constructed. The clients who'd remained with Apex Marketing during the crisis had done so because they valued the strategic expertise I provided, not because they were impressed by a facade I'd created to hide my insecurities about my professional capabilities. During the cocktail reception that followed the ceremony, I found myself in conversation with several potential clients who were specifically interested in Apex Marketing's approach to ethical business development. The crisis that had nearly destroyed my practice had inadvertently created a new market niche: companies that wanted strategic consulting with unprecedented transparency and integrity safeguards. The disclosure protocols you've developed are exactly what our industry needs, explained Dr. Sarah Chen, the CEO of a major healthcare consulting firm. We've been looking for a way to ensure that our competitive intelligence work meets the highest ethical standards, and your methodology seems to be the most comprehensive approach available. These conversations represented a fundamental shift in how I understood my professional value proposition. Instead of hiding behind carefully managed facades, I was building client relationships based on authentic expertise and transparent business practices. The strategic thinking that had always been my core competency was now enhanced by ethical frameworks that made my recommendations more trustworthy rather than less impressive. The evening's most unexpected moment came when I noticed a familiar figure approaching through the crowd of reception guests. Ryan looked different, more confident, more substantial, wearing a well-tailored suit that suggested his career had continued progressing during our separation. His approach was unhurried and purposeful, carrying none of the uncertainty that had characterized our final months of marriage. "Jessica, congratulations on the recognition," he said warmly, extending his hand with a smile that was both genuine and appropriately distant. "I've been following Apex Marketing's rebuild in the industry publications. What you've accomplished is really impressive. His presence at the reception was initially confusing until I noticed the TechFlow corporate logo on his name badge and realized he was attending as part of Amanda's team. The promotion he'd been seeking during our marriage had apparently materialized, along with responsibilities that included industry relationship management and strategic partnership development. Thank you, Ryan. I heard about your promotion to senior project director. Amanda mentioned that you've been instrumental in developing TechFlow's new ethical business practices division. My response felt natural rather than forced, evidence that enough time had passed for us to interact as professional colleagues rather than former spouses processing relationship trauma. The conversation that followed was remarkable for its complete lack of tension or unresolved emotional undercurrents. We discussed industry trends, compared notes on business development challenges, and even shared some genuinely funny observations about Austin's networking culture. The ease of our interaction suggested that both of us had moved beyond the hurt and anger of our divorce into a genuine appreciation for each other's professional capabilities. I owe you an apology for something, Ryan said as our conversation wound down. During those final months of our marriage, I was so focused on feeling betrayed by your deceptions that I never acknowledged how impressive your professional accomplishments actually were. Building Apex marketing into what it became required. Exceptional strategic thinking and business development skills. His acknowledgement was both unexpected and deeply meaningful. The recognition I'd craved during our marriage, genuine appreciation for my professional capabilities rather than patronizing tolerance of my hobby, was finally being offered, even though it came too late to save our relationship. I appreciate that, Ryan, but I also owe you an apology. My approach to managing our relationship was fundamentally disrespectful to your intelligence and your right to make informed decisions about your own life. The protection I thought I was providing was actually a form of control that prevented both of us from being authentic with each other. The mutual acknowledgement of our respective failures felt like the completion of a process that had begun, with his departure 18 months earlier. We'd both grown beyond the people we'd been during our marriage, developing capabilities and perspectives that might have allowed us to build a healthier relationship if we'd possessed them earlier. But there was no nostalgia or regret in our conversation, no suggestion that these insights should prompt reconsideration of our divorce. Instead, there was a comfortable recognition that we'd both become better people through the painful process of ending our marriage and rebuilding our individual lives. Actually, there's something else I wanted to mention, Ryan continued, his tone shifting slightly to indicate the introduction of a new topic. I'm engaged to someone I met through the industry networking events I started attending after we separated. Her name is Michelle, and she's a software architect who actually appreciates having a partner with complementary professional skills. The announcement of his engagement was surprising, but not painful in the way I might have expected. Instead, I felt genuine happiness that Ryan had found someone who could appreciate his professional capabilities without needing to manage or protect his confidence. The relationship he was describing sounded like the kind of partnership between equals that our marriage had never achieved. That's wonderful news, Ryan. I'm genuinely happy for you, I replied, and meant it completely. It sounds like you've found someone who can be a true professional partner rather than someone who thinks partnership means careful management of ego and information. Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Amanda Chen, who approached with the purposeful stride of someone ready to transition from social networking into business discussion. Her timing suggested she'd been monitoring our interaction and had chosen this moment to introduce the professional opportunity she'd mentioned earlier. Jessica, Ryan, I hope you don't mind the interruption, but I wanted to follow up on our earlier conversation about the ethical consulting partnership, Amanda said, including Ryan in her address in a way that suggested he was involved in the potential collaboration. Ryan's been leading the development of our conflict of interest protocols, and we think there could be substantial synergy between his internal expertise and Apex Marketing's external consulting capabilities. The possibility of working professionally, with Ryan was intriguing rather than uncomfortable, evidence that we'd both moved beyond our personal history into genuine mutual respect for each other's professional contributions. The collaborative opportunity Amanda was describing would leverage his understanding of corporate ethical challenges and my experience developing transparent consulting methodologies. "I think there could be real value in that kind of partnership," I replied, looking at Ryan to gauge his reaction to the possibility of working together. The combination of internal and external perspectives could create something genuinely innovative in the ethical business practices space. Ryan nodded thoughtfully, his expression suggesting he was evaluating the professional opportunity without any concern about personal complications. "The protocols we've developed internally have been effective for TechFlow, but we've struggled with how to scale them for broader industry implementation. External consulting expertise could be exactly what we need to make this approach accessible to other companies." The discussion that followed was entirely focused on business strategy, market opportunities, and implementation challenges. There was no awkwardness about former spouses considering professional collaboration, no undercurrents of personal history affecting our assessment of the business opportunity. We'd successfully transitioned from failed marriage partners to potential business colleagues who respected each other's expertise. As the reception wound down and guests began departing, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought me to this moment. 18 months earlier, I'd been sitting in my living room watching my marriage collapse while reporters gathered outside and my business faced potential destruction. Tonight, I was being recognized for successfully rebuilding both my professional reputation and my personal integrity while discussing new opportunities for growth and collaboration. The transformation hadn't been achieved through strategic planning or careful management of information, the approaches that had previously defined my problem-solving methodology. Instead, it had required accepting responsibility for past failures, developing genuine transparency in all my relationships, and rebuilding my professional practice on foundations of authentic expertise rather than carefully constructed facades. The drive home to Cedar Park took me through the familiar neighborhoods where Ryan and I had built our life together, but there was no sadness or regret in passing the landmarks of our shared history. The house I returned to was the same physical space we'd shared, but it had been transformed into something entirely different. A home that reflected my authentic preferences rather than a showcase designed to maintain appearances. The award ceremony and the professional opportunities it had generated represented validation that felt more meaningful than any recognition I'd received during the height of Apex Marketing's initial success. The achievement being celebrated was genuine rather than constructed, built on ethical practices and transparent relationships rather than careful compartmentalization and strategic deception. As I prepared for bed that night, I opened my laptop to review the preliminary proposals Amanda had sent for the ethical consulting partnership with TechFlow. The irony of potentially building my practice's future on a collaboration with the company I'd once targeted for competitive intelligence was profound, but it also felt like appropriate closure to the ethical crisis that had nearly destroyed everything I'd worked to build. The business opportunity was substantial and exciting, but what made it truly significant was that it represented the culmination of a complete transformation in how I approached both professional relationships and personal integrity. The woman, who'd hidden her success to protect her husband's ego, had become someone who built client relationships on complete transparency and mutual respect. The consulting partnership with TechFlow would likely become the foundation for the next phase of Apex Marketing's growth, but it would be growth built on authentic capabilities rather than carefully managed perceptions. The strategic thinking, that had always been my core strength, was now enhanced by ethical frameworks that made my recommendations more valuable rather than less impressive. 6 months after the awards ceremony, I stood in the same conference room where Amanda Chen had confronted me about my ethical failures, but this time we were partners reviewing the preliminary results of our collaborative consulting program. The Ethical Business Practices initiative we'd developed together had attracted 12 major clients in its first quarter, generating revenue that exceeded my most optimistic projections, while establishing new industry standards for transparent, competitive intelligence. Ryan had become a valued collaborator whose insights into corporate culture and ethical implementation had proved essential to our consulting methodology. Working with him professionally had been surprisingly natural, evidence that we'd both grown beyond our personal history into genuine mutual respect and collaborative capability. The success we were building together felt more sustainable and more meaningful than anything I'd achieved during my marriage, partly because it was based on authentic relationships rather than careful management of information and perceptions. The compartmentalization that had once seemed essential to managing complex circumstances had been replaced by integration and transparency that made both my professional and personal life more satisfying. The transformation from strategic deceiver to ethical consultant had required abandoning the approaches that had initially built my success, but it had also revealed capabilities and values that were more substantial than anything I'd achieved, through careful manipulation of circumstances. The woman who'd hidden her achievements to protect others' egos had become someone who built success through empowering others to achieve their own authentic potential. As I locked my office that evening and walked to the parking garage where my car waited, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought me from the ballroom of the Driskill Hotel, where Ryan had introduced me as a little graphic designer, to this moment of genuine professional fulfillment and personal integrity. The success I was building now felt more valuable than anything I'd achieved during my years of careful deception, not because it was larger or more impressive, but because it was authentic and sustainable. The strategic thinking that had always been my greatest strength was now enhanced by ethical clarity that made my work more meaningful rather than less effective. The transformation had required losing everything I'd thought I valued: my marriage, my original business success, my carefully constructed identity. But it had revealed capabilities and values that were more substantial than anything I'd achieved through compartmentalization and strategic deception. The woman driving home through Austin's evening traffic was fundamentally different from the one who'd stood in that hotel ballroom watching her husband dismiss her professional capabilities. She was someone who'd learned that authentic success was more valuable than impressive facades, that genuine relationships were more satisfying than carefully managed perceptions, and that ethical clarity was more powerful than strategic deception. The journey from hidden success to authentic achievement had been longer and more difficult than any strategic plan could have anticipated, but it had also been more transformative and more rewarding than any carefully constructed outcome could have provided. Sometimes the greatest victories came not from protecting what you'd built, but from having the courage to rebuild everything on better foundations. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.